Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 2 of series 8. The question for today is a physicalist theory of mind or consciousness inescapable or incoherent? The reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 6, Section 1. In last week's introduction, I outlined the significance of consciousness as a basis for an appreciation of value. I also said that a foundation for value can be found in the subjective structures of consciousness, and that consciousness is a gateway into grasping the enigma of human existence. Yet there are also many theories and different ways of understanding mind or consciousness, such as dualism, physicalism, monism, externalism, pluralism, panpsychism, and panprotopsychism, as well as functionalism and behaviorism. The two basic theories that we will examine today are dualism and physicalism, sometimes called materialism. Dualism regards consciousness as a different kind of being to the rest of the world, whereas physicalism regards consciousness as a very refined aspect of the physical world. Cartesian dualism is a particular kind of dualism that we will discuss shortly. I will outline dualism as a contrast to physicalism. That is our main topic today. To start, a basic distinction can be made between mind and consciousness, but they are often used interchangeably. Like John Searle, we can provisionally define consciousness as all the mental states that we experience. Broadly speaking, mind can include every aspect of mental life, like the unconscious and animal minds. Awareness can be described as a particular focus of consciousness, like being perceptive. We can also distinguish between consciousness and typically human reflective or self-consciousness. And of course, in my view, the physical brain can be distinguished from both mind and consciousness. We should note three different questions that are often conflated and hidden in theories of mind. 1. What is the ontological status of mind as either physical or mental? 2. What are the preconditions of mind? Neurological preconditions are often taken as the mind itself. And 3. The question is, what is the character of mind? And this is my main concern that I examine in these workshops. I myself hold an interactionist theory of mind and a structural account of consciousness as a process or relation. I will explain and argue for this position in forthcoming workshops. To examine physicalism, we should first outline dualism and Cartesian dualism opposed to physicalism. Descartes characterized mind by rationality, transparency, indivisibility, and non-extension in space. He further described mind as thinking substance. These properties are supposed to define mind as a different kind of thing to the physical world. But both the properties themselves and the Cartesian relation to mind to the world has been widely rejected. This is partly because Descartes took the notions of both rationality and substance from Renaissance science. Transparency is refuted by the presence of the unconscious, and indivisibility by split brain and other discoveries. And in my view, although mind may not be extendable in space, it is subject to graduation. So when reversed as opposites, Descartes' properties begin to provide certain features of mind. But two unacceptable features of a Cartesian conception of mind are: one, a conception of mind as a substance or kind of definitive object, and two, the difficulty of explaining how a Cartesian immaterial mind can act causally on the world. This difficulty of explaining interaction between mind and matter encourages physicalism, and the widespread rejection of Cartesian dualism led to this supposedly more scientific view of physicalism. That is, mind and matter are composed of the same physical stuff, of which mind is an extremely refined kind. Physicalism, materialism, physical monism, and mind-body identity theory are of this same view. Although intuitively unattractive, physicalism is dominant in analytic philosophy. Yet there are tacit forms of physicalism, such as describing mind or consciousness as energy. And physicalism is implied in Stoic philosophy, science, and postmodernism. We will look at these views shortly. Three main arguments can be cited for physicalism. These are: one, that dualist perceptions are mistaken; two, the coherence of science requires unified principles; and three, science and neurology can provide a detailed explanation of mind. The physicalist argument that dualist perceptions are mistaken can go back to Descartes' "I think, therefore I am." This was supposed to provide an indubitable basis for knowledge, including knowledge about God. But his accompanying idea of the transparency of mind has been widely rejected. This is because the unconscious and other arguments show that the contents of mind isn't transparent, and the experience of mind is different from knowing what mind is. Paul Ricoeur, for example, holds that the cogito ergo sum enjoys a presumed certainty that can be deceived about itself. Sartre also explains that the I am doesn't follow from the I think, which are different kinds of mental state. There are further objections to Descartes' "I think, therefore I am," such as Descartes qualified this knowledge as certainty, but consciousness is graduated, which opposes absolutes. So certainty is challenged both as a criterion of knowledge and as a practical objective. And the underlying concepts of self and I think are a posteriori, not absolute creations. Physicalists further claim that dualist mistakenly perceives one thing as two. For example, thunder and lightning are two different manifestations of the same phenomenon, an electrical discharge. Or perhaps more telling, the morning star and the evening star, which are the same star. Yet these arguments are subject to further judgments and considerations, such as, although many perceptions are mistaken, dualists claim that their perceptions aren't mistaken. This is because it's self-perception, in which the perceiver and the perceived are the same thing. We will look at this kind of argument shortly. Another physicalist argument is that the coherence of science requires a unity under the same principles without ontological disjunctions. William James noted that the resolution of ontological and theoretical disjunctions has led to certain discoveries. But against this view of unification, it can be strongly argued that science isn't unified in this way. Firstly, Hume's empiricism account shows that science isn't governed by a single known principle. And secondly, the inclusion of both mathematics and physics argues against a monist account of science. That is, physics is an a posteriori science of contingent observations about the physical world. But mathematics and logic make a priori judgments of necessary relations about abstractions. So both the content and methods of mathematics and physics are radically different. Unlike logic, physical science is contingent and diverse in principle. Therefore, science is a pluralist, not a unified monistic discipline. Yet there are other explanations of the prevalence of physicalism in science. That is, the attractions of apparent unity and objectivity are ulterior motives for adopting physicalism. For example, science tends to want to remove consciousness from its perspective to achieve objectivity. This is a classic criticism of phenomenology about science. A third argument for physicalism is that with neurology, the mind can be explained as an aspect of the physical world. For example, with brain scans and fMRI, science can show correspondence between neurology and mind. The work of Benjamin Libet, for example, detected unconscious brain activity before any recognized intention to act. This supplemented D.M. Armstrong's earlier argument for an underlying physical substratum. These are supposed to be evidence of a physical substructure of mental as physical events. Sam Harris asks us also to imagine a imagining device to detect the subtlest changes in brain function. This indicates what we were going to do before we had any awareness that we were going to do it. The conclusion is that events previously considered mental events are in fact physical events. But the physicalist claim is that the brain scans and fMRI show correspondence between neurology and mind. So this shows a correspondence between mind and brain, but it doesn't prove mutual identity. Moreover, this correspondence lacks precise detail, and again only hoped for by faith in scientific advances. Accounts by Libet and Harris aren't conclusive and overlook causation by holistic complexity. That is, the holistic character of thought that can't be captured by particular neural events. And consciousness is also an amalgam of states greater than the sum of its parts. Such failures of correspondence lead Donald Davidson to speak of anomalous monism. So science and neurology can't provide a detailed explanation of mind as an aspect of the physical world. And this ability is highly contested as a current ability, and is seen rather as a future aspiration. The above is an outline of arguments for physicalism with some replies. Yet there are many other theories of mind that are in themselves arguments against physicalism. These include the noted externalism, pluralism and panpsychism that we'll discuss in later weeks. Moreover, there are anti-physicalist views which need not imply any of these alternatives. Two of these are the arguments of David Chalmers and Saul Kripke. Chalmers is famous for stating what he calls the hard problem of consciousness. The hard problem is explaining how any physical system gives rise to conscious experience at all. He argues that conscious experience cannot be reductively explained. That is, in terms of something else that is not consciousness, which is anti-physicalist. He uses the concepts of supervenience and structure in his arguments. To explain supervenience, life or the biological seems to be supervenient upon the physical. That is, under certain given conditions, life must emerge from the physical. It also seems that consciousness or mind is supervenient upon the biological. That is, under certain biological conditions, consciousness must emerge from life. Chalmers' argument is that mind is naturally supervenient on the physical, but mind isn't logically supervenient on the physical. This gives Chalmers a distinction that enables him to claim what he calls naturalistic dualism. But it is contentious that his distinction between logical and natural supervenience is adequate to imply dualism, because, as he admits, all sorts of properties fail to supervene logically on the physical. But he answers that conscious experience is almost unique in its failure to supervene logically. In my view, this seems to be because natural relations supervene logically as well as naturally. Again, in my view, another example of non-logical supervenience is Hume's is-ought distinction. That is, ought prescriptions don't supervene logically on matters of fact or existence. But before leaving Chalmers, I will note how he attempts to explain conscious experience. He does this with the structures of supervenience, functional organisation, and organisational invariance. Functional organisation is a form of complexity and organisation that enables a function of producing consciousness. Organisational invariance is a form of complexity and organisation that must produce consciousness. In his own words, Chalmers defines organisational invariance as, I quote, any system that has the same fine-grained functional organisation will have qualitatively identical experiences, whether the organisation is realised in silicon chips, in the population of China, or in beer cans and pong-pong balls does not matter. But Chalmers is disingenuous here, and as John Searle points out, this asks far too much of structure alone and ignores the importance of its constituents. And this view leads Chalmers to make his infamous claim about conscious thermostats. We don't have time here to say more about Chalmers' complex theories. Another less well-known but much respected critique of physicalism is offered by Saul Kripke. Kripke holds that it is absurd to suppose that the identities of minds might not be discovered. This is because the awareness of that identity is essential to its existence. That is, Kripke argues against physicalism by distinguishing personal identity as a property of consciousness. Personal identity isn't attributable to the physical world, and it is discovered by a priori awareness. Physical identities are discovered contingently in an a posteriori fashion. Kripke clarifies his view with the concepts of rigid and non-rigid designators. A rigid designator, as the name Clark Kent, designates the same object in all possible worlds. But a non-rigid designator, such as the mild-mannered reporter, need not designate the same object. Kripke focuses on the rigidly designated property of personal identity. This distinguishes a unique aspect of consciousness differentiated from physicality. Kripke's argument has also been associated with property dualism. This is the view that consciousness has properties that physicality does not and could not have. I will present a form of property dualism shortly, using structures of consciousness. Yet one non-structural distinction can be derived from the scientific concept called the law of conservation of mass. That is, matter can change through physical and chemical changes, but through these changes, matter is conserved. None is created or destroyed. But in contrast to this, consciousness is often created and destroyed in birth and death. But it seems remarkable that the two arguments of Chalmers and Kripke are so obscure and indecisive. That is, because they are about the compelling intuition that consciousness isn't of the same stuff as physical matter. And we might expect such a compelling intuition to have an equally compelling argument. And the general lack of arguments for the anti-physicalist position is, in my view, also remarkable. I give one explanation for this in my account of the self-obfuscation and obscurity of consciousness. This might also help to explain why physicalism is the majority view in analytic philosophy, as well as why there is such a plethora of physicalist theories. For the sake of completeness, I will now quickly run through a number of different theories of physical monism. These include behaviorism, functionalism, and eliminative materialism. Firstly, Spinoza's double aspect monism is that mind and matter are different aspects or attributes of a unitary existence. Spinoza held that they are two of an infinite number of modes of one reality he identified with God. But it's debatable whether this is a form of physicalism, although the physical is certainly affirmed. Behaviorism is a materialist or physicalist position that reaches across both philosophy and psychology. Behaviorism sees the meaning of mental states only in terms of actual or potential patterns of behavior. But it explains mind in terms far removed from experiences of the phenomenal self. And one argument against behaviorist account of sensation is that it must take place in the body. But there are actual as well as hypothetical cases where the mind and brain are isolated from the body. For example, Susan Greenfield's study of the loss of all neural communication between mind and body. Therefore, it seems that behaviourist accounts of mind are deeply inadequate. Functionalism similarly explains mind in terms of its function of what it does. And in this way, it offers a more subtle approach than behaviorism. But the same criticism can be made of both functionalism and behaviorism. That is, they neglect conscious experiences, phenomenal qualia, and self-consciousness. Eliminative materialism holds that only material things exist, and therefore common sense understanding of mind is false. Wilfrid Sellers, Willard van Orman Quine, Richard Rorty, and Paul Feuerbund hold this view. But Feuerbund was open to other possibilities in his later years. Richard Rorty held a disappearance theory of mind, which is a variant of eliminative materialism. Disappearance theory holds that mental states like pain and love should be replaced by brain states, for example, C fibers, and that talk about mental states are outdated, like talk about demons and witches. Yet such views of Rorty and Furman are consistent with postmodernism, which has physicalist inclinations. This is because postmodernists reject a coherent or unified concept of mind or consciousness. They also reject the idea of universal structures underlying the whole of human life. But they are thinking of the social and psychological structures such as of Marx and Freud. Yet phenomenologists are instead talking about structures of consciousness, not of psychology and society. And postmodernism has physicalist inclinations which rule out consciousness and thereby rule out structures of consciousness. The physicalism, cognitivism and epistemological concerns of analytic philosophy also ignores structures. Yet Gilles Deleuze is still able to describe individuality as differential, forever dividing itself and changing. Deleuze postulates multiple faculties giving rise to feeling, thought and action. For example, he writes that schizophrenia is not only a human fact but also a possibility for thought. But I describe this as this divisibility as a structure of consciousness, not as an argument against it. I noted earlier that properties or structures of consciousness argue against physicalism as well as other theories. Yet postmodernists argue against the idea of such structures, and others like Colin McGinn hold that consciousness is too insubstantial to have structures. This is an argument discussed in the future as well as in past workshops. I can only briefly state here that against deniers of consciousness, that consciousness exists, and because it exists, it must have properties. And I argue that these properties are best explained as structures. These are structures like intentionality, temporality, and graduation. The significance of structures as an argument against physicalism is stated by John Searle, who writes that irreducible intentionality would be fatal to physicalism. Yet he qualifies this by saying it would be a rather hollow victory for the anti-physicalist if he could defeat his opponent only at the cost of admitting something of which he was equally incapable of giving any satisfactory explanation. And that can be avoided in part with a more comprehensive structural account of consciousness. So to repeat, my own account is an interactionist theory of mind and a structural account of consciousness as a process or relation. Numerous structures can be listed to characterize consciousness and to argue against physicalism. These include graduation, insularity, temporality, insubstantiality, ephemerality, as well as intentionality. Sartre unrestrainedly names a multiplicity of features as structures. These include freedom, choice, presence, facticity, value, possibility, negation, and finitude. But I think these are features or properties rather than structures because they aren't internally inherent or give shape or form to consciousness. Yet the structures noted above can be briefly described as following. Intentionality is a process or relation in which mind comports itself towards its external cognitive objects. In this way, intentionality has both interiority and exteriority, both of which have certain qualities. Divisibility explains perceptual contrast both for cognition and for the difference required in the production of value. It also explains the possibility of fragmentation, schizophrenia, fission, and split brain phenomena. Temporality explains how consciousness is a process moving through time and space in an ever-changing flux. Consciousness is thereby continually forced to adapt, producing values and perceptions in the process. Graduation shows that consciousness is subject to diminution as well as increase, with the final diminution of death. The graduation of mind as well as mental states implies the view that is opposed to a binary perspective. Insularity is a form of ontological solipsism. Every conscious being is ontologically separate from every other, and there cannot be a comparison with other beings in the same way that one experiences oneself. In conclusion, we have been asking about the character of consciousness in a physicalist theory of mind, but insisting that consciousness is an aspect of the physical world ensures that it won't be understood. The physical world is understood through empirical a posteriori observation. Mathematics is understood through necessary a priori relations. Consciousness must also be understood according to its own characteristics. Consciousness has a different mode of existence and must be understood in a different kind of way. That is, through a first-person perspective and phenomenological observation, as well as with fact and reason. I myself argue for an interactive and structural view of consciousness as a relation and process. Beginning with Descartes, Husserl said that he opened the door of consciousness but didn't go in. Consciousness isn't a kind of substance. Descartes took this notion from Renaissance science. Descartes assigned mind with the features of rationality, transparency, indivisibility, and non-extension. But it can be argued that he was mistaken on every one of those features. And paradoxically, his notion of substance alludes to a form of physicalism. Yet arguments against physicalism aren't as straightforward as the dualist intuition might suggest. The unity of science and the possibility of misperception can't be so easily dismissed. And the arguments of Chalmers and Kripke are complex and liable to be misconstrued. Chalmers and Kripke cite supervenience and personal identity, respectively, as reasons to reject physicalism. I myself cite structures and other reasons for this conclusion. And these are some of the reasons why I adopt a structural account of consciousness. That is, both as an argument against physicalism and as a way of characterizing consciousness. So let me have your comments or criticisms at the meeting or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com.